Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, everyone. So Andre is here as well. He's the other co-founder of Iteratively.
Everyone.
Thanks, Carly, for joining us as well, she's been an early adopter of Iteratively, I think from the beginning, one of our first customers. So she's on the call as well. Just a little quick background on us. Andre and I started Iteratively at the beginning of 2019. We'd probably be remiss to say we spent about 6 months really trying to figure out what we wanted to do. So we ended up interviewing as many folks as we could, primarily folks like product managers, analysts, engineers, marketers, to try and understand the pain points that they had. And after the 6 months, we ended up learning a few different things. But the number one problem that we actually heard from over 350 interviews at 150 different companies was folks not trusting the data that they're capturing. And a little bit of background on myself. I'm a product manager design by trade. Andre is an engineer. So this is a bit new to us, but I'm sure not new to the folks on this call. But what we ended up realizing is that there's just a lot of human error related to analytics instrumentation and capture. So what we saw a lot of teams doing is they'd end up instrumenting analytics, and they'd have duplicate event names or properties that weren't following the same conventions, or they'd have folks not being able to trust the underlying data that they're capturing. And what we saw a lot of teams doing is creating what was in the industry called a tracking plan to really try to outline what their analytics schema looked like. And we saw this in spreadsheets or in Confluence pages, a lot of the times, Notion pages, Airtable, you name it. And those were the sort of the best of companies, where we saw a lot of companies building internal solutions. And once we actually saw this, we decided that we actually wanted to come help solve this problem, to actually help teams define, instrument, and validate their analytics so that everyone can capture data that they trust. And there's a few reasons that we ended up resonating with this, but I'll jump into that in a bit. But really, the focus was really on making sure that teams had an always up-to-date tracking plan that really outlined what they were capturing, where they were capturing it, and why they were capturing that data, and that they can socialize that internally to get everyone on the same page. And the way that we actually ended up going about doing that is actually I'll pause there because this is really sort of loose. I'm happy to answer any questions, but anybody have any questions at this time? Okay. And the way that we ended up doing that was really twofold. One is we ended up creating a web application that allowed data consumers to really go outline what their analytics schema looked like. And this was really trying to replace the spreadsheet. So making it really easy to define what are the metrics that you care about, what are the events, what are the properties on those events, so that you can capture this data and send it to tools like Segment or Amplitude or even your own custom data pipeline. In this definition phase, we saw a lot of problems specifically related to nomenclature and consistency. And so we wanted to really try to provide a lot of the best software engineering practices that software developers have around things like pull requests and versioning, and really try to build a collaboration platform for your analytics. Secondly, we saw a lot of issues sort of introduced within the developer workflow. So a lot of developers would fat finger event names. You have your iOS team capture an event called user signed in, and your Android team capture an event called user logged in, really sort of leading to a lot of mistrust within the organization on what data you can actually reliably depend on. And our solution on that side was really we saw a few companies like Circle CI, from Claire from the DVD community as well, companies like Airtasker, Atlassian, a lot of these best software teams really trying to build type-safe SDKs that really helped them to standardize on what their analytics schema looked like and help developers instrument analytics in a reliable way. When we saw these companies adopting these solutions, it usually involved twofold: either a lot of engineering time to actually build internal solutions, or on the back end, a lot of analyst time or data consumers time actually cleaning up or munging the data, and you get into a state that was really reliable. And so we wanted to front load as much of that effort as possible in the definition phase, and then help engineers actually reliably instrument the data so that, and then validate that the data that you're actually capturing was reliable. And so what that process really looks like is, before, we saw a lot of folks using loosely typed SDKs. So you can create your own analytics library or use an off-the-shelf library, and you send whatever arbitrary data you want into this client. And sort of the future phase is you'd actually use a strongly typed library, which would have inline documentation, code completion, all of the niceties that engineers sort of come to expect from modern software tools built into their IDE. So this is what we've built, and I actually just would love to give you all a demo to show you sort of how it works today. And I'm also happy if anybody has any questions to jump on in too. We're a small group today. Cool, I'll do a demo. Okay, let me just jump on in. So we're going to be instrumenting a simple app. So imagine you're a product manager or a data analyst working at a lightweight Jira competitor called ToDos. You can create simple to-dos here. So if I wanted to create a new to-do, I can create a to-do, and we're firing a to-do created event down below. This is actually being sent to Amplitude. I can delete this to-do, and we're firing a to-do deleted event. So as the product manager, as an analyst, I might want to know how often a to-do has been modified. But we're not firing any data. So this is a gap within our instrumentation that I actually want to go rectify. So let me go create a new event called to-do modified. And so here you can see the existing events that I'm actually tracking here. And so this is the Iteratively web application. You can kind of think of this as like GitHub for your analytics. This is where the entire team comes together to really collaborate on what they're tracking. So we're tracking 4 events today: created, deleted, cleared, and toggled. Let's add a new to-do called to-do modified, called when a to-do is modified. And we'll actually track that on our web source. Not created a new event called to-do modified. You can see right away that this event isn't being captured anywhere. And the reason that we know that is because we actually integrate sort of at the source code level to understand where your events have been instrumented, not at the runtime level. So we'll go into that in a bit. Let me add a new property called to-do ID, the ID of to-do. We'll leave that as a required property, but this, you can actually mark this as optional if you wanted. And when you leave this as required, what it basically is enforcing is it's enforcing your developer to actually add this property into the event when they're sending it to whatever data store you actually want to capture that data in. We'll leave that as a string, but you can change this to whatever data type that you actually wanted to support. So if you wanted to make this an enum, or if you want to make this an array, all the data types that are backed by JSON schema are supported within Iteratively. Great, so I've added a to-do. And one of the things that we actually saw quite often is, as I mentioned earlier, is the definition phase actually accounted for quite a lot of the errors. So you might have different PMs on different teams, different folks not really following the same conventions. So we wanted to make sure that we can do some basic linting in the web application. So in the context, my team's naming convention is actually snake case, not kebab case. Let me actually go update this. And providing some basic feedback to the user, right, as they're defining their analytics in context of the application. Additionally, in that property, you can specify any rules that you want to be enforced, whether or not it's a min length or a max length or a regex that you actually want to validate this property against. Again, the reason and the value here for the data consumer is that you can actually have all of this enforced up front when your developer is actually instrumenting this data, instead of having to munch the data or transform it downstream. And yeah, if it was a number, you can enforce whether or not it's an integer, so on and so on. Okay, so I've added my event. One of the things that's probably worth calling out here is source has a runtime specified for it. So each source, you'll actually provide what the actual runtime is, whether or not it's Android Kotlin, browser TypeScript, iOS Objective-C. And what we do is we actually code gen a purpose-built SDK for your developer that matches that source. So in the context, web is a TypeScript application, our to-do app is a TypeScript app. We'll actually generate a TypeScript SDK for your developer. So this is pretty much how the process works for adding new events and adding properties to an event. Let me go publish a new version. We're trying to, again, we're really trying to focus on having a collaborative workflow, bringing everyone onto the same page about what you're tracking and why you're tracking it. So let me go, actually I'll mention Andre, please instrument this new event. When I actually publish this, this publishes it as a new version. So similar to GitHub, you can have multiple different branches. You can branch into the master branch. Again, we also have versions. So you can actually roll back in time to see all of your different version updates on your actual analytics schema. So Andre, you mind if I hand it off to you to actually do the instrumentation?
Okay, I got questions before the implementation.
Yeah, let's do it.
That I've been Storing up. Okay. Thinking about. So on this, okay, so a little bit of background. I've done some of this and I've used segments equivalent, I think, of what you're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've really liked it. I've liked having that sort of interface to be able to define the data and then give that to a developer to implement, right?
Mm-hmm.
In here, can you edit the JSON schema directly?
Not yet. So we
Okay.
expose, so like on the property itself, we expose a UI on top of JSON schema.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's stored as JSON schema, but we don't actually expose like a code editor for somebody today.
I found myself using that not a ton. Like I used the UI in segment, but I liked being able to see the JSON schema and edit it as well.
Got it. Let's get rid of these. So like being able to edit the JSON schema directly.
Yeah.
Got it.
I love that you have a GitHub backend for your schemas. Like that was something that was really lacking, I felt. Where I'm like, why is there not just a repo with all my schemas in there, right? Can you show me that? Is that something
Yeah.
I can hook up to my own repository somewhere? Like, how does that work?
It's actually stored in a database, so it's not actually stored in a
Mm,
Git repo per se. It's actually stored in a database that we version and manage. Um, but like everything is exportable. So if you wanted to export a particular version of your schema in JSON schema or in Thrift or other types of file formats, you can actually export any of your analyzed schema into whatever format you want.
hmm. Okay. I I might recommend, because this was my thought about it, is that most of the time schemas are some sort of text, right? With a nesting structure that could be a folder structure, and having it as an actual GitHub repo. This was like when I was thinking through implementing, like, how would I do this? Same thing. I liked the idea of having the repo because then I could even use it in other places too, right? So if I have some sort of ETL process, I could actually import the same schema into my ETL process and be like, okay, pull that in and do another transform or something like that.
Yeah, it makes 100% sense. I think we're trying to make it easy for people to programmatically export the schema for ETL.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were, like, Andre, happy to have you jump in here on the reasons why we chose to go with the database architecture versus just having a Git repo architecture.
I mean, yeah, Dylan, I can go into a little bit of the detail, but like it's just so much more flexible to be able to store the data in a database as opposed to a flat file, which is what it would look like in Git. But I think you're still spot on, and we have a lot of customers that have been kind of talking to us about that and like wondering, hey, how do I bring the schema into my GitHub repo? And one of the things that Patrick showed was publishing of new versions in Iteratively,
Mm-hmm.
and we've got a couple things that happen automatically when a new version gets published in our product. And the idea that we're thinking about is to actually call into GitHub and check the new version and the new schema into a customer's GitHub repo automatically, so that if they want to have the latest and greatest available inside GitHub and have GitHub in sync with what's in Iteratively, that would be super easy for us to do.
Fantastic.
Yeah, our goal is if somebody wants to use the UI, they can. If somebody wants to do it programmatically, they can as well. So we want to expose everything as a configurable option.
I have a question about the property. So To-Do ID, I imagine that's a property that's going to be shared across a lot of events for this app. Is that is sharing properties possible?
100%. Thanks for asking, Claire. So you can create templates today. So if I actually wanted to create like a to-do basket, we'll just call it like to-do template, common properties across to-dos. I can create a template, and this template still has an owner, has an activity feed as well. But if I wanted to actually go in here and add the to-do ID property, the ID of the to-do, we'll leave that as a required string. I can then go back to the event itself and actually add that template, to-do template. And you'll see right away that the to-do ID now shows up here. And it's actually associated with the template. So if I wanted to go to to-do deleted and actually add that here, I can. And then that property will show up here. You can also add templates to sources as well. So one of the things that we see is pretty common. So you might want to add some context to a particular source in the context of web. What are the common web properties that you want to capture? You can actually add templates here as well. Did that answer your question, Claire?
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw connected destinations there.
Yeah.
Is that something you want to talk about a little bit later, or could talk about now?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it now. Basically, so each source is connected to one or more destinations. So for instance, our web source is connected to Mixpanel, Segment, and Amplitude. We'll basically multiplex from the client. So you can configure however many different destinations you want, and you wire them up in the web app, and we'll multiplex after the data has been validated to whatever different sources or different destinations you want. And vice versa, if you have a particular destination, you can actually see what connected sources are sending data to this destination.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, this is very similar to sort of the segment experience, except that it happens on the client side, which is the majority of how segment actually operates, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a limitation too.
Yeah,
where segment does it on the client side.
Yeah. Okay, so
do you store any of the data intermediately, like segment does?
Sort of like in memory, or like batching, or like usually.
Yeah, I mean, segment, I don't know exactly their implementation, but essentially I assume that they store it all in like S3. Like they have a history of all the events that are sent. And in some use cases, that's really useful because they can replay the history. So they'll do like a thing where they're like, replay all these events that happened. They can also you can also, through their tool, browse recent events. And then there's also the concern, like there's also a concern with that where, they're storing the data. And if you have any sort of PII or privacy concerns, having a third party might not be good. So it's, it's both sides, but I'm just wondering what your take on that is.
Yeah, no, good question. So we don't actually see any of the data today. So we're not actually in the runtime. So none of the data flows back to our servers. So what the best way to think about it, actually might have this diagram down here, might help show, is that we have the tracking plan app that generates the clients. We validate the data and then we send it to wherever you want to send it, but nothing actually comes back home to the tracking plan. So if you're sending data to Segment, what we end up doing is you'll actually download the Iteratively SDK and the Segment SDK, and we'll act as a thin wrapper on top of the Segment's SDK, validate the data, and then if it is valid, we'll pass it on to the Segment SDK.
So this is all going from client to wherever I want it, not passing through you at all.
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that's been it's been a bit of an advantage for the bigger companies that we've been working with, not passing through their data.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see that. That does mean if you want to add a source, though, if you want to add a destination, you're going to have to do a code update, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
There's pros and cons to that. I think one of our things that we're trying to do is be as close to the SDLC process as possible so that you're actually testing your analytics. And we can actually talk about how we're trying to help make analytics testable, integrating with end-to-end test cases, unit tests. When I hand it off over to Andre.
Great.
Let me stop sharing if I can. There we go. There you go, Andre.
Thanks, Patrick. Cool. So yeah, I'll take it over from where Patrick left off. So Patrick, you published a new tracking plan, correct? With a couple new events for me to implement?
Go publish that now. Okay. Here you go. Here you go, Andre. There we go.
All right, I got a Slack notification. Thanks. All right, so I'll put the developer hat on for a second and just quickly run through what the developer experience looks like. So on my machine, obviously I have my IDE set up with the project that Patrick and I are collaborating on. I had also previously installed the Iteratively CLI. So we ship a developer toolkit that developers install on their machines that lets them interact with the Iteratively service and pull down the SDKs that have been personalized for their tracking plan. that SDK or that CLI is also used to verify that analytics have been implemented correctly in the product, and I'll show you all of that in a second. So the first thing I did is I installed the CLI, I initialized it in my project, and authenticated to my account in Iteratively, and then I had previously called itly pull web, and this command brought down the latest and greatest analytics SDK for our company that had all of the events that Patrick had defined for us prior to this latest version in this session. So that's all been done, and those 4 or 5 events that were in the tracking plan before have all been implemented. And the way that I know they've been implemented is by running Iteratively verify. So Iteratively verify is like a linter for your analytics in your source code. It scans your project, finds all of the tracking calls in your product, and compares them to the most recently pulled down version of the tracking plan, and tells you if any are missing or if any have been implemented incorrectly in the product. And right now everything is good. All 5 are in the product today. So let me now bring down the latest version of the tracking plans. This is the one that Patrick just published. And there's a new event that's been added, the to-do modified event. There's also another stale event that's been removed before we started the session. So the to-do modified event is the one that I care about. As you can imagine, if I run Iteratively verify again, the to-do modified event hasn't been found. It's not in the source code. And actually, if I try to check in the code right now, our CI would catch this problem and reject the commit altogether. The Iteratively CLI can run on a developer's machine, but it can also run in CI and can be used as a gatekeeper for commits to make sure that those commits aren't breaking analytics in the product. So let me go and implement the to-do modified event. So just like any other SDK, I will import it into my project. And also just like any other SDK, I will initialize it in my starting code path. And then I'm going to go up to where the to-dos get saved in our application, and I will go ahead and track the event. So because this SDK has been cogened, all of the events that Patrick defined in the tracking plan become methods on my SDK. So I get auto completion for all of my analytics events, the descriptions, the owner, some of the other useful metadata that's available in the tracking plan is included as code docs in the SDK. So it shows up right there in line for the developer to help them figure out what they actually need to do with this particular event. So in the case of the to-do modified event, I will select the event, and I will pass a set of properties. Now, if this was an event that didn't have any properties, then none would be required. All I would have to do is just call track to do modified and be done. But Patrick actually did define a required property on the event, and without me passing that property in, the code isn't even going to compile on my machine. And my IDE is telling me that the to-do ID property is actually missing in my code. So let me add it in, get auto completion for those as well. The ID of the to will be set to save ID, and I am all good. Looks like there's another event that's been
deleted.
Yep, this one has been deleted as well. So let me get rid of this one. We no longer need to track this event. It's gone in the tracking plan. And if I run Iteratively verify now, I will be all green. And if I was actually integrating Iteratively into my CI, I would have CI run Iteratively verify with the -u flag, which tries to close the loop on the whole analytics instrumentation process. So it'll actually call back home to our web service and tell or update the tracking plan with the latest implementation status, so that when Patrick comes back to the tracking plan and wants to know which events we're tracking as a team, which events have yet to be implemented, he will get a latest and greatest status of the plan. So let me kind of show you what that looks like. The app is telling me that the to-do modified event has in fact been instrumented, and the to-do modified event is green. And if I hover over the icon, the app will tell me when we actually begun tracking this event in the product less than a minute ago. That's when I implemented it. So this is again how we try to close the loop on this and keep everybody up to date on not only what events have been defined in our tracking plan, but also which events are implemented and live in the product.
Is there a reverse view of that where you can just see a timeline with when things went on and off?
Yeah, so if I had, that's right. So all of the events get versioned in the product. This one was deleted, but if I find, I wonder if I have another example. I could log into another account. Yeah, all of the events get versioned. So if I had multiple versions of this particular event that's been implemented and unimplemented over time, I will see exactly when events were added, when were they removed, when were they upgraded to the latest version in the code. So when did the developers begin tracking the latest and greatest version of each event, all of that information gets tracked and then displayed to you so that you can kind of piece together the evolution of an event over time. Does that make sense?
Is that history exportable in any way? Like, can I pull it out, take it with me?
Yes, so all of the schemas, all of the versions are exportable. Today they get exported as JSON schema. We can also export them in an Igloo compatible JSON schema format. So if you've got another registry like Snowplow Igloo, you could import them there as well. And we're thinking about exporting them as Thrift and Protobuf formats as well.
Cool.
It's very rare that a product manager gets a definition right the first time, in my experience. You know, they say track this when this happens, and the developer will say, yeah, but like when they click the button, or when the request comes back successfully, or when they get to the completion screen, like there's 7 different times when you could say this happens. What does that process look like if a product manager doesn't get it right the first time and the developer needs to give feedback on the event that they've requested?
Want to create a branch, Andre?
Sure.
Make sure they approve workflow.
Create a demo branch. And let's make sure we have our approval workflow settings enabled. So there's a couple things that we do. So one is you get to create kind of private workspaces for your tracking plan. So if you want to collaborate with other people on your team, with developers, with customer success folks, or whoever is going to be consuming those events, you get to create a branch on the side, invite everybody into that workspace, and solicit feedback around the changes that you're proposing. So in this particular case, I created a new branch called demo. I could create another event called to-do updated, which is actually similar to to-do modified on purpose, and create that event. And request a review. So just like in GitHub, where you create a pull request for your code, you get to create a merge request for your analytics schema, describe the changes that you're proposing, and create a merge request. At this point, 2 people, this is what I had configured, will need to go in and have a look at the changes, comment on them, let me know if they are good to go. Developers can at that point also bring down the schema, try to implement it in the product, see what works, what doesn't. Maybe some of the properties were a good idea in the product manager's head, but in reality, they're very difficult to obtain in the source code. So implementing them and instrumenting them in the product is actually really hard. So at that point, the developer can go back and let the PM know that, hey, this particular property, can we get rid of it, or do we really need it, or should we add another one instead that's very similar? And it will be around this merge request that conversation happens and that feedback gets solicited. When everything is good to go, everybody's happy with the tracking plan, and a new version gets published, and the branch gets merged into master.
So you don't need to publish the version in order to pull down the SDK for it.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's right. So the cycle can be really, really fast between defining a new event or updating an event and then implementing it in the product to see if that definition is good and workable.
I could see, as soon as I asked this question, I could see Patrick smiling like, yeah, we got this one.
I was laughing because all ideas in a product manager's head are great. Just you put them on paper.
I have one other question, but I might accidentally expose how much I know about how tracking really gets implemented. One thing that I remember when I did this project was that some like event receivers had like particular, I don't know, like ways that you could tag properties. Like you could tag like particular events as conversion events or revenue events and like name them in a really particular way. Or for like experiments, there were ways to like that you had to sort of name things. And so I remember when we did this, we had to have this like extra layer of mapping that said, okay, this one's a revenue event and this one's a conversion. How does that work when, like, if I understand this correctly, because I was a bit late to this meeting, if Iteratively is passing on these messages to those services, how can you sort of like play with the way that they get sent on to that service?
It's like the reserved names, Andre.
Yeah.
That's right, Claire. Yeah, this is really interesting. We've been coming across this quite frequently lately as we begin adding support for more destinations. And some of these destinations have reserved event names and reserved property names that mean special things inside those destinations. And sometimes, you know, one thing needs to be represented in 3 different ways depending on which destinations you're sending that thing to. So we don't do anything special today. Today, you would have to define that property 3 times with 3 names, and then just make sure in the description you tell the developer to set each of the 3 properties to the same value, because you know that the data is flowing to 3 different destinations. But what would be really cool is if you could just define the property once and indicate in the tracking plan, hey, this is a revenue property. And because we know which destinations you have hooked up to your tracking plan, we will then at runtime convert that property name to the appropriate name for that destination before firing the event off to that destination.
Yeah.
So do like a quick transformation on the client side.
Yeah, I think like another thing that we were trying to do was also not send every event to every destination. I think for some reason, like the experiment platform we were using, we didn't want to send some events to it. So we had to think about that as well.
Yeah, Patrick's smiling again. So yeah, actually the filter or the destination selection happens at the event level. But of course, it makes a ton of sense to do it at the property level as well for some of these use cases. So that's on our roadmap also.
Oh, cool. But so at the moment, you could conceivably say to do updated, only send it to Amplitude and Optimizely, but don't send it to Google Analytics.
That's right.
Okay, cool.
That's correct. Yeah, that happens at the event level. Over here under sources, you get to pick the sources that the event will be sent to. Then when we generate an SDK for web or for backend, we'll only include the events in that SDK for that source that have been linked to that source.
Oh, I mean more like in the destination side of things.
Not at the source. So like the destinations today are tied. So each destination is tied to the source. So if you wanted to configure that, you'd have to create 2 different sources. So you have to create like the web, like intercom, and then web amplitude, and then configure at the, configure which event you want on which source.
Yeah. But truly, we were like doing weird things because we had weird setups. So don't listen to our edge cases.
Yeah, there's cases like intercom only supports so many user traits and so many total event names, unique event names. So there are cases where some of these underlying destinations have unique requirements that you do have to take that into account.
Yeah. Cool.
Good. We do have Carly here as well, who has been using the product.
I have a question about the implementation before jumping into Carly's use case.
Go ahead, Dylan.
So what about I understand that the type checking, so like on that ID field you implemented, the type checking is enforced by the strongly typed language. What about non-strongly typed languages like JavaScript or Python?
Yeah, good question. So for things like Python and Ruby, we at least cogen type hints in the SDK to give the developer a little bit more guidance as to what the type should be for each and individual property, but that's not always enforced. So what we do in the SDK, Dylan, is we actually have a pretty lightweight JSON schema validation library that's built into the SDK that validates each and every payload that's flowing through us to the underlying SDK beneath us. So when the properties and events get defined in the tracking plan, and when we generate the SDK, we'll generate the SDK along with the JSON schema for each and every event. And then we validate the payloads against that schema. And that helps us catch not just type problems that the developer might have introduced in weakly typed languages, but also problems with the values themselves. So in JSON schema, you can say, for example, that a particular value of particular property needs to be an enum. It can only have one of 3 values, or it needs to be an integer, or it needs to be an integer between 1 and 10. And those things.
Or match a regular expression.
And match a regular expression, exactly. We call those rules inside our UI. Obviously, those you can't catch and compile them. You can only catch them at runtime. And that's when the JSON schema validation kicks in and actually makes sure that everything is good about the event, not just the types, but also the values.
And so this happens on all of your SDKs then as well?
Yes, this applies consistently across all the SDKs. Mm-hmm.
And then what if somebody wants to, I guess I'm kind of wondering about that SDK generation a little bit. Mm-hmm. You have some list of languages you support, right? Is there anybody who's been trying to like fork that code to add any features on top of it or create an extra wrapper around your SDKs that you're generating? Or
yeah, good question. So not today. When we codegen the SDK today, we codegen the whole thing. So you get a pretty thin wrapper. It's usually a single file. Sometimes in some languages it's multiple files that does very little work before actually handing off the events to the underlying SDK. It really just does validation. That's really all the SDK does, in addition to the strongly typed layer. That's which is represented in the function signatures themselves. So there hasn't been a need to extend it, or we haven't seen one yet, or wrap it in yet another layer. What we are doing though is we're gonna split out the static part of the SDK from the dynamic part of the SDK. The static part of the SDK handles like validation and actually put that up on GitHub. That's completely open source. Anybody can have a look at the code and make changes to it, do whatever they want. And only codegen the strongly typed layer itself, the one that contains the function signatures and the JSON schemas. And that will be probably 5% of the overall code. 95% of it will be in the static SDK up on GitHub. And then whatever you want to do with that is up to you. If you want to modify it, as long as the interface between the static and the dynamic part is the same, you can do anything you like.
That's pretty cool.
That's good to hear.
I'll tee up a question to Carly. Carly, I know we've been working together for quite some time. It might be helpful to sort of just describe what was the reason for adopting iteratively at Artifact Uprising.
Sure. So the way we were implementing events before, this is what I inherited, but we were using Google Tag Manager to call segment, which is like actually the reverse of what you actually want to do, and tracking all of our events in a spreadsheet that obviously became very outdated. So we had a ton of problems with that's one screenshot that Patrick shows at the beginning of his deck where the event is like all of a sudden like just dropping off. That was us like all over the place. That was what just that one screenshot allowed us to get approval to buy the tool, Patrick. So anyway, we knew we needed to make some changes and implement it the right way. And while I was just I guess I must have seen Patrick post something in the DBT channel, just like a blog article you'd written about event analytics, and I was like, oh well, yeah, we need help.
I think Claire posted that.
Oh, Claire posted it. Okay. And I was like, well, this looks interesting. And
I'm waiting for my commission on that one.
Yeah.
So we could have done what we've ended up doing is ripping out GTM and calling all of our events with direct segment calls. And we absolutely could have done that without iteratively, but it would have been a complete mess. Just in his examples, we wouldn't have had type safe calls. We wouldn't have had a tracking plan would have been in Excel as we've been doing. And it would have been really painful to maintain. And now I feel really confident about maintaining the work we've done. I'd say we're probably like 90% done on our website side, and we're still working through the app right now. But I feel so much more confident that our engineers understand what's happening. Really, our only risk is making sure the events fire. So I know they're implemented correctly, but if we make a code change and all of a sudden we're not firing order completed, which actually happened last week, right now Iteratively can't save us from that. But outside of those things happening, I feel confident that the events are going to be called correctly.
Sounds like you'll like one of our features coming up quite a bit.
Good.
You have a report section that I saw on your UI.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have in there? Because that's kind of where I'd imagine if I was looking at the UI to look for something that would be like, okay, here's how many events fired for this thing over this time. But of course, you're not keeping that data because we're bypassing you just using the SDK. So that becomes an interesting problem. Okay.
We don't. Yeah. Right now, it's really just like coverage across your sources to make sure your events have been instrumented. So this gives you sort of like an overview if you are tracking an event similarly across. Actually, I can find one where I would be doing that. Yeah, like this one user signed in. I'm tracking it across, and you can see which version 1.0 that is tracked and where it's being tracked from. But yeah, the notion is to actually give you like a sparkline view at some point on what is happening both in development as well as in production. So actually processing the data at runtime and giving you some insight into what is actually happening related to your tracking plan.
How do you, I mean, pulling back the covers a little bit, how do you plan to do that?
Andre?
Yeah, a little bit about it. Questions. Yeah, like Patrick said, one of the big perks right now is that the SDK is super simple. It doesn't phone home. It doesn't do anything, right? It just like calls segments SDK under the covers. It's really easy. No questions to be asked by anybody. But of course, with this, we're going to be extending the SDK a little bit, where by default in development environments, we're going to take some statistical information about the events that are flowing through the Italy SDK and send them home. Just like segment, just like spanal or amplitude, a very similar technology to take them and collect them on the back end, and then display them in the UI. We have plans to make it possible for developers to tell us whether they want to just capture the statistical information or whether they want to capture the whole event. Like we imagine that in some cases in dev, when you're debugging analytics, for example, it would be really helpful to have a single pane of glass for events that are being sent through the Iteratively SDK across all of your platforms and actually see what those events look like and what are the values that are being passed for various properties. And then later on, for companies that don't have some of the kind of GDPR, CCPA concerns that a lot of large companies have, they can enable that in production as well, and we'll capture the data and send it over to our system as well. On the back end, I don't know, I could get into some of the more technical juicy details, but yeah, like a little time series database that captures all of this information and does some aggregations on the data to power things like graphs and spark lines and some anomaly detection as well when we detect that, hey, something's not quite right, and the event that was flowing at this rate last week is flowing at a very different rate this week. Is that a problem with your analytics instrumentation, or is that a problem with your product or with your business? Those are some of the things that we'll be able to do once these data points begin hitting our backend.
That's cool. And then, do you have a way? Because that is a common problem for the, like, I have a dev version of the code that's running, or a stage version, and some QA person's hitting events and sending those events that they look the same as prod events. Would you just create different? Are you creating different sources for dev and stage and prod, and then requiring that during the build process that they're moving them through those? Like,
yes.
How do you solve that?
Yeah, so sources as they are defined now will stay the same. So there's still only one iOS source or Android source or web source for your application. but we're introducing the concept of environments. You can create as many of those as you like. By default, you'll get local, dev, and prod. But like I said, you can create more if you like. And when you initialize the SDK, you tell us which environment you're running in, and maybe that's driven by something like node env or whatever the equivalent is in your application. So that when events are flowing to us, we know where they're coming from, which environment they're coming from, not just which source they're coming from, but also which environment they're coming from, and you get to track them and visualize them per environment in the UI.
Thank you for solving that up front.
Really, this is really helpful, Dylan. That yeah, it's something great, and like this tells us that we're, which are we on the right track? Are we on the wrong track? There was a couple things that you asked about earlier that were pretty telling. That if you don't mind, I would love to follow up with you and just ask you some more questions about that stuff. So
sure,
thanks.
I don't mind. Yeah, and I want to also give a shout out to Claire's question about the templates, because as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh yes, that combined with the environments. I did this in Segment where I had a source for each environment and then copying and pasting like the same events across all the environments to make sure that it's all aligned. This is a much better solution.
Okay.
What's your pricing model?
So yeah, we want to be different than typical vendors out there right now. So because we don't actually see any of the day-to-day, we want to have a freemium offering so anyone can get started on the tool and then charge per user per month. So similar to what you expect from Jira and GitHub, we would charge you sort of a flat rate per user per month. And yeah, so right now, actually, let me just share the screen. That might be easier. Launched this a couple weeks ago. So yeah, like the user limit right now is up to 25 users, which should be pretty easy to get started for most organizations. This product will be completely free. The developer platforms, you get 3 developer platforms and 1 analytics destination. And then you get all the collaboration, versioning, CI/CD integration. We imagine that about 40% of our user base would probably fall into here. On the enterprise side, this would be where the per user per month charge would be. And yeah, you get sort of unlimited user seats, but we'd equate it to per user per limit. And then you get sort of the merge approval workflows. These are more of the enterprise features that we've been talking to around companies, around having sort of governance around your analytics schema. Doing things like PI enforcement, Dylan, which I know you mentioned earlier. So like enforcing that PI is not actually being sent to third-party tools. And then yeah, event health monitoring, which is more of the runtime component and anomaly detection that's built into that. Any questions sort of on this or any feedback?
The developer platforms are like the number of SDKs, right? Like generating for iOS, yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I know whenever I'm user limited and in a small setting, I'm going to create 1 user and share it with 5 people, right? But definitely some of the other pieces I can see enterprises really caring about, the PII one, and then also just running up against. I think it makes a lot of sense to do it by development environments and destinations.
Got it. That's great to hear. Yeah, I think we want to make it as predictable as possible so that you understand like what you're getting into and that there's no real lock-in. So if you wanted to leave, you can leave. You're not tied to us. The analytics clients that we generate are yours to keep. So if you wanted to ever migrate off of the platform, you don't have to rip our code out of your product, which you have to do today for a lot of the vendors. We're really focusing on the collaboration and trying to drive value there as you add and modify your existing analytics and giving you that peace of mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful position to be in, especially with what current vendors out there are offering.
Yeah.
Carly, this is more a question for yourself. When you implemented Iteratively, did you use that as an opportunity to sort of to like redo your event schemas? And what did that like? Do you have any advice for someone who is working with an app that has really inconsistent events, sort of like a plan of attack for cleaning that up, or any lessons learned the hard way?
Yeah, so we absolutely redid everything with our events, including how they were named. Previously, our events were called viewed product. And Segment actually recommends calling them product viewed.
Yeah.
To doing, what is that, noun and then verb?
Yeah, object action.
Object action, thank you. Anyway, so I actually use Segment's recommendations. They have some really good specs on their website for e-commerce. And I really just used that. I was like, I'm new to this, so I'm just going to go with their best practices and use that as a starting point. And what's great is if you call things according to Segment specs, and you're using Segment, of course, your downstream integrations will automatically work. So for instance, if you have Facebook hooked up to your Segment events, Facebook recognizes if it's called order completed. So you don't have to really do a lot of customization. So it's made a lot of our downstream integrations a lot cleaner. So I highly recommend spending the time up front to standardize both your event names and the property names. Like we were calling it, like one of the properties, we were calling it product SKU. Like, no, you should just call it SKU because it's on the product viewed event.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're thinking about doing as well is actually having default tracking plan templates. So if somebody wanted to get started with Iteratively, they'd actually go in and all of the events would be pre-created. All of the metrics and properties would be pre-created for them for if you were a SaaS B2B business or if you're an e-commerce business. And so it would give you all of that clarity. And then all you have to do is generate the SDK for your developer and it has all of the events built in for you.
Oh, I think
that's a great idea.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
It's just one of those things where it's like, where do I start? What am I doing? Like, I know when we did it at Airtasker, we like mapped so many customer journeys and we're like, okay, what are all the events that you need if you wanted to track like this customer life cycle? Because we weren't just a typical e-commerce company. It was crazy, like the depths. And it's because event tracking is so hard because if you get it wrong, you just don't have that data. You can't go back and get it. So Carly, did you like just throw out?
Yeah, we ran into that too. So before I joined, we were tracking so many different things. Our company, we make photo albums, and we were tracking like edited image, rotated image, made it brighter, made it black and white, and it's like we weren't doing anything with that data. So now we're just tracking data for no reason. So I went kind of the total reverse and said like, less is more. Let's just track the bare minimum of what we know we need for our core funnel. And as things come up, we'll add it. We also use Heap, so we can do events kind of ad hoc in Heap if we need to.
Yeah.
But if something pops up and okay, now for instance, we just realized we aren't tracking the login screen. We aren't tracking whether it's been displayed and if somebody's logged in. And now somebody wants metrics on that. Okay, so we'll implement it, and then within a week we'll have metrics. It's not. I would definitely go with less is more. Because you'll just be confused if you have more. That's my feeling. I don't know about Patrick and Andre. I think y'all agree. I think I asked you that early on what your thoughts were.
Yeah. I mean, like it scales. I think the notion of like being able to track consumption of the data, like is the data actually being used, is super important. Just making sure that like it's good data hygiene at the end of the day. Claire, you actually had an interesting where you were actually able to pause all the work at Airtasker to go re-instrument for what, 3 weeks?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and like that I think is unheard of.
Yeah. Well, we also spent a lot of developer time building our solution, so we had to deliver something. Yeah. So at the time, 2 years ago, we didn't have any other options. Segment hadn't come up with their thing, and one of our key data team tenants was like, "Don't build, just buy." But we couldn't buy something for this. So, I think that we would. If I were in that position, we'd buy it today. I'm a minute left. I'm going to squeeze in a question. Carly, I actually really liked that point you were making around track less rather than more. Do you think that having the complement of Heap as well is like beneficial for that? And are you keeping Heap around? And yeah, how do those two tools work together?
I do like Heap. It's very expensive. And we're in a 2-year contract, so we are keeping them around for at least another year. I will say Heap has allowed us to actually find a lot of the data issues. Whether you use Heap or something else, you do need something to be able to report on your funnel events, because we never would have known that we weren't firing events if we weren't actually looking at it in Heap. You could accomplish the same things in Looker if you're already on Looker and you just build that out manually, but Heap allows you to do a lot more ad hoc comparisons of your events. The reporting in Heap is less than desirable, especially if you're used to Looker. Heap is a little sad, but that's just not the space that they want to play in. They want you to pull data out and then put it into your BI tool. So I think Heap really is great if you want to create a lot of ad hoc events. So like right now we're about to run like a Father's Day sale on our website. And if we want to track how many people are clicking on the banner that's like 15% off for Father's Day, I'm not going to go into Segment and Iteratively and create a whole new event for that. That's just like way overkill. But I could go into Heap, and anybody in the company who has the right access permissions could go create that ad hoc event. And it's also retroactive. So if, let's say the banner launches today and we don't create the event for a few more days, it'll catch the historical events. So Heap is great, but I think it kind of just depends on what your use case is, and it's expensive.
Yeah, that's really interesting context to have. We didn't have a tool like Heap, and I think potentially over instrumented to account for it when like okay, well, we need to implement a new event for that banner for this sales campaign, specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we're at time, so I'm going to let everybody bounce. But thank you so much, Patrick and Andre. This was awesome. I did not ask any questions because Dylan and Claire asked all the questions. It was perfect. It was great. But totally, this was really awesome. And I echo many of the sentiments expressed by them. This was such a painful space 2 years ago, Claire. I feel your pain. I was doing the same thing 2 years ago, not getting the developer time to actually build the right tool, just beating my head against it.
We definitely appreciate everyone's time, and thanks so much for the feedback. It was epic.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much.